Hey everyone, welcome back to Buried Truth Project. Today we're diving into one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. But forget the Halloween costumes and the simple story of mass hysteria. What really happened in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 is far more disturbing, more complex, and more relevant to today than you ever imagined. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our deep dives into history's darkest moments. Alright, let's jump in. Let's start with something most people don't know. The Salem Witch Trials didn't actually begin in Salem. They started in a tiny settlement called Salem Village, which is now known as Danvers, Massachusetts. And it all began with two young girls playing a dangerous game. In January 1692, 9-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams started having bizarre fits. They screamed, threw things, contorted their bodies into strange positions, and complained of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. The local doctor examined them and found no physical cause. His diagnosis? The girls were bewitched. But here's what most history books don't tell you. Betty and Abigail had been experimenting with fortune-telling games with their father's slave, a woman named Tituba from Barbados. They were trying to see visions of their future husbands by dropping egg whites into a glass of water. In Puritan society, this was considered dabbling in the occult, a serious sin. When the girls started showing symptoms, many historians believe they were faking illness out of fear of being punished for their forbidden activities. What started as two girls trying to avoid punishment spiraled into mass panic that would claim 25 lives and destroy an entire community. Now here's where it gets really dark. The first 3 women accused of witchcraft were carefully chosen targets. They were the most vulnerable members of society. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who went door to door asking for food. She was poor, pregnant, and had a reputation for muttering under her breath when people refused to help her. People claimed these mutterings were curses. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him. She rarely attended church, which made her automatically suspicious in Puritan eyes. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados who had taught the girls the fortune-telling games. She was foreign, practiced different spiritual traditions, and had no power or protection. Notice the pattern? Poor, powerless, and different. These were people the community already feared or disliked. The witch trials gave them a legal excuse to eliminate those who didn't fit in. But here's the twist that changed everything. Tituba confessed, and her confession was absolutely wild. Under interrogation, Tituba told elaborate stories about flying through the air, meeting with the devil who appeared as a tall man in black, and participating in witch meetings where they plotted against the Puritans. She claimed there was a whole conspiracy of witches in Salem working for Satan. Why did she confess to something she hadn't done? Because Tituba was smart. She'd seen what happened to people who denied the charges. They were hanged. Those who confessed, repented, and named others were spared, at least temporarily. Her detailed confession saved her life. She was never executed, but her testimony opened the floodgates. If there were more witches, the authorities had to find them. The trials exploded. Within months, over 200 people were accused. Men, women, even children as young as 4 years old were imprisoned. And here's something that will make your blood boil. The evidence used to convict people was absolutely insane. Spectral evidence was allowed in court. This meant if you claimed you saw someone's spirit or specter tormenting you in a dream or vision, that was considered valid proof of witchcraft. You couldn't defend yourself against spectral evidence. How do you prove your spirit didn't leave your body and attack someone while you were sleeping? They used the touch test. If an afflicted person stopped having fits when touched by the accused, it proved the accused was a witch drawing back their evil power. They looked for the devil's mark. Any mole, birthmark, or blemish on your body could be evidence that Satan had marked you as his own. You literally could not win. The system was designed to produce guilty verdicts. Here's one of the most heartbreaking stories. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. He knew the system was rigged. He knew that if he pleaded and was found guilty, his property would be seized by the government and his family would be left with nothing. So Giles stood mute. The punishment for this was called pressing. They laid him on the ground, placed a wooden board on his chest, and piled heavy stones on top, slowly crushing him to death over the course of 2 days. Every few hours, they'd ask if he was ready to enter a plea. His only response, according to legend, was more weight. Giles Corey was crushed to death, but because he never entered a plea, he was never convicted, and his sons inherited his farm. He died protecting his family, and his death remains one of the most brutal executions in American history. And here's something truly chilling. Many of the accusations were driven by personal grudges, property disputes, and old feuds that had nothing to do with witchcraft. There was a massive divide in Salem Village between the wealthy merchant families in the eastern part and the struggling farming families in the western part. Neighbor accused neighbor over land disputes. Women accused other women who had offended them years earlier. The trials became a way to settle scores and eliminate rivals. Rebecca Nurse was a 71-year-old, deeply religious woman, respected by everyone. But her family had a long-running property dispute with the Putnam family. Suddenly, members of the Putnam family started having fits and accused Rebecca of witchcraft. Despite a petition signed by 39 community members testifying to her good character, Rebecca Nurse was hanged on July 19, 1692. If someone like Rebecca Nurse could be convicted and executed, no one was safe. By September 1692, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. One man had been pressed to death. At least 5 people, including Sarah Good's infant daughter, had died in the filthy, freezing prisons while awaiting trial. And over 200 people were still imprisoned, waiting for their turn in a courtroom that had never acquitted anyone. But then something changed. The accusations started reaching too high. Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor of Massachusetts, was accused of witchcraft. Suddenly, the authorities realized the accusations had gone too far. If the governor's own wife could be accused, then the entire system had spiraled out of control. Additionally, several prominent ministers, including Increase Mather, began speaking out against spectral evidence. Mather wrote a letter stating, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." In October 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer that had been conducting the trials. He established a new superior court with strict rules. Spectral evidence was no longer admissible. Touch tests were rejected. The standards of proof were raised dramatically. When the trials resumed in 1693 under these new rules, of the 56 people tried, 52 were acquitted. The madness was over. The trials ended not because people stopped believing in witchcraft, but because they realized the evidence being used was worthless. But the damage was catastrophic. Families were destroyed. The community was fractured. And here's the part that should haunt us. Not a single person executed was actually a witch. They were all innocent. Let's talk about what really caused the Salem Witch Trials, because the full truth is more complex and disturbing than simple mass hysteria. First, there's the medical theory. Some researchers have suggested the afflicted girls might have been suffering from ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain in wet, cold conditions. When consumed, it causes convulsions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior, exactly what the afflicted girls exhibited. But here's the problem with that theory. It doesn't explain why only certain people were affected or why the symptoms appeared and disappeared so conveniently during court proceedings. Second, there's the psychological theory. The Puritan community was living under incredible stress. They were in constant fear of Native American attacks. King William's War was raging on the frontier, and refugees were flooding into Salem with horrific stories. They believed the world was ending and that Satan was mounting a final assault on God's chosen people. The girls who started the fits had enormous power suddenly placed in their hands. In a society where children, especially girls, had no voice or authority, they suddenly found themselves the center of attention with adults hanging on their every word. Third, there's the socioeconomic theory. Salem Village was deeply divided between the wealthy eastern merchants and the struggling western farmers. The witch trials became a proxy war for these deeper conflicts. Almost all the accusers came from the western farming families. Almost all the accused came from the eastern merchant families or their supporters. The truth is probably a combination of all these factors: medical issues, psychological stress, religious extremism, social divisions, and personal grudges, all colliding in a perfect storm of paranoia and violence. Now let's talk about the aftermath, because what happened after the trials is just as important as the trials themselves. Many of the accusers and judges eventually expressed regret. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching for the tragedy. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood up in church and publicly apologized for his role in the trials. And Putnam Jr., one of the lead accusers who had testified against 62 people, made a public apology in 1706. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan and asked forgiveness from God and the community. She died unmarried and in poverty at age 37. But here's what's infuriating. Most of the accusers never apologized. They went on with their lives. Many of them prospered. The girls who had screamed and convulsed in court grew up, married, had children, and never spoke of what they had done. The families of the victims fought for decades to clear their loved ones' names. It wasn't until 1711 that the colony finally reversed some of the convictions and offered compensation to the victims' families, though the amounts were insultingly small and many families received nothing. But here's the truly disturbing part. Not all the victims were exonerated. It took until 1957, 265 years later, for the state of Massachusetts to formally apologize and clear the names of the remaining victims. It wasn't until 2001 that the final 5 victims were officially exonerated. Let that sink in. People executed in 1692 weren't legally declared innocent until 2001. The stain of the witch trials lasted over 3 centuries. Let's talk about the lessons we failed to learn, because the Salem Witch Trials aren't just ancient history. They're a warning that we keep ignoring. The trials show what happens when fear overrides reason, when accusations become proof, when being different becomes dangerous, and when authorities prioritize social control over justice. We've seen it again and again. The Red Scares of the 1920s and 1950s, when being accused of communism could destroy your life. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s, when innocent people were imprisoned based on children's coached testimonies about impossible satanic rituals. Every generation swears they've learned from Salem, and every generation finds new witches to haunt. Salem teaches us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty when they're afraid. The judges weren't monsters. They were respected members of the community who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. The accusers weren't evil. They were mostly young girls caught up in something that spiraled beyond their control. That's what makes Salem so terrifying. It wasn't caused by evil people. It was caused by normal people who let fear, superstition, and social pressure override their judgment and their humanity. Here's one final story that captures the tragedy perfectly. Sarah Good, the homeless beggar who was one of the first accused, was hanged on July 19, 1692. At the gallows, Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess. Sarah Good's last words were, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Reverend Noyes died of a hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. The people of Salem remembered Sarah Good's curse. But it wasn't magic or witchcraft that killed him. It was guilt, time, and coincidence that gave her words power. The real curse of Salem wasn't supernatural. It was the knowledge that innocent people died, that the community had torn itself apart over nothing, and that it could happen again anywhere, anytime people let fear override justice. So there you have it, the dark, disturbing truth about the Salem Witch Trials. From 2 girls playing a forbidden game to a community consumed by paranoia. From the systematic persecution of the vulnerable to the lessons we still haven't learned. What's the most shocking thing you learned today? Let me know in the comments. And here's a question for you. Can you think of modern examples of witch hunt mentality in today's world? If you enjoyed this deep dive into dark history, smash that like button and subscribe to Buried Truth Project for more untold stories. Thanks for watching, and remember, the truth is always deeper than the surface. I'll see you in the next one.